there are countries, there are regions in which the initials I, M, and F make people break out in hives.
You did touch upon the role the IMF may be called upon to play. Is it possible to do a debt restructure without the IMF as one of the parties around the table?
Yes, it is possible. Belize is doing it right now. It does not have an IMF program. There are countries, there are regions in which the initials I, M, and F make people break out in hives. Now, part of that is history, but to bring the IMF into the process has many advantages for the debtor country. It will get a lot of free advice, sometimes a bit more than it may want. It will get some money. But to my eyes, the critical thing that the IMF brings to the process is that, let's suppose we're dealing with commercial creditors in the form of bondholders. As a group, there may be thousands of them. As a group, they have neither the resources nor the inclination to do the kind of study of the country's economy and what adjustment measures may be necessary for it to recover its financial footing. And so when the country goes to those bondholders and says, we want whatever we want, a 40% principal haircut, the bondholders have no institutionalized mechanism for vouchsafing whether that is indeed what the country needs. As a creditor, you always have the lurking suspicion that it's what the local politicians want, not necessarily what they need. But if the IMF is involved, you see, and let me state this as a general proposition, at base, every sovereign debt restructuring comes down to one simple burden-sharing judgment. How much of the adjustment of the country's economy is to be borne by the citizens of the country in the form of fiscal adjustment, higher taxes, lower public sector workforce, stripping off subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. How much is to be borne by the citizens in the form of fiscal adjustment, and how much by the creditors in the form of debt relief? And there's almost a dollar for dollar trade-off. Get an extra dollar of debt relief, it's $1 less of fiscal adjustment that you as a local politician will have to impose upon your citizenry, and vice versa. So who is to make that judgment? Surely not the debtor country, because politicians will of course favor debt relief over fiscal adjustment, because the latter tends to have consequences in the next election. It cannot be the creditors, because they have the opposite prejudice. The only institution we have on the planet that purports to have both the technical expertise to make that judgment and the political legitimacy to do so is the International Monetary Fund. Technical capacity because they have extraordinarily talented economists who have been doing this for the last 50 years and therefore are expert in making those judgments, and political legitimacy because most countries of the world belong to the organization. So it isn't that the Ruritanian politicians have to say to their citizens, oh, this group of foreigners are coming in and telling us to raise your taxes. They at least have the cover of saying an organization to which Ruritania belongs is coming in and offering these prescriptions. It's a little bit of cosmetics, but often found useful. And by the IMF program, implicitly, rarely explicitly, implicitly, the IMF is saying to the bondholders, let's take our example, that the debt relief Ruritania is seeking from you is both necessary to achieve sustainability and this is crucial, proportional to the contribution that the Ruritanian authorities are offering through their fiscal adjustment. And that is the crucial thing that the commercial creditors will look for. Those are the benefits of having the IMF in. The downside is that they will prescribe or may prescribe fiscal adjustments that are politically unpopular in the debtor country. And that can cause some political problems in some countries. And the IMF will be the first to admit this, in the past, they have occasionally gotten this mix wrong. It is not a science.
Sure. You talked about an amount of relief that has to be extracted. What does this amount look like in practice? Is it a cash flow that you're looking at? Is it a yield at the end of the period that you would want the creditors to have? What is this number? What is this amount of extraction?
The IMF economists can come in and will come in sometimes and say to a country, you're simply carrying a debt stock, a gross debt stock, beyond your reasonable capacity to service. And by reasonable capacity, I mean, in one sense, every country could repay its debt if it were prepared to take extraordinary measures. I remember being involved in situations where creditors would say, why do you have a debt problem? Simply sell Patagonia to the Chileans, sell the Acropolis to BlackRock, this sort of thing. The judgment, and this is what I was referring to earlier, the judgment that the IMF economists have got to make is what are plausible fiscal adjustment measures, measures that would stop short of producing a revolution in the country politically, and stop short of actually damaging the country's economy permanently. And so they will assess that. Sometimes the fund will say, no, it isn't the gross size of your debt stock that is the problem. It is the maturity profile. You have an Himalayan spike coming up in the next 2 years. There is no way that you're going to be able to repay that unless you have complete market access. And therefore, the objective is to push that out, iron it out to a sustainable debt profile. So this will be a bespoke judgment depending on the circumstances of the country.
Do IMF programs related to restructuring differ from the usual IMF program? If so, how?
The IMF programs will come in one of three types. If the assessment of the IMF is that the debt is unsustainable, then they will ask for a debt restructuring as part of the program. If the debt is viewed as sustainable, but in effect a liquidity crisis, there may well not be a request for a debt restructuring. There'll be other fiscal adjustment measures. And if it falls in between, where the staff can neither with confidence say it's sustainable or unsustainable, then the outcome may well be a reprofiling again, don't be misled by the word reprofiling. Reprofiling is a species of debt restructuring, just the mildest one, with no coupon adjustment and no principal haircut. So, yeah, but look, if the debt is deemed unsustainable, I imagine the fiscal adjustment program will be harsher than it would be if the assessment were that it's a simple liquidity problem.